this idea of feeling like an orphan is something that I personally can identify with. We just feel like we're not at home. We feel like maybe we have to measure up in certain situations. Maybe we feel unapproved of, and so we're trying to fill that gap in different places in our lives. And what we said is, while we all have that problem, it's a default human condition. It's spiritual in nature. It actually goes back to the very first story of human beings and their relationship with God, Adam and Eve, that there's also this promise that God really sets himself up in Scripture as a father who is inviting his children back home. And so we want to go on that journey together. So that's what we've been doing. And last week we said really a big part of beginning the journey is recognizing the places in our life where we have misconceptions or misperceptions about God. Things that maybe aren't true about God, but that we've believed to be true. And this week is really, if last week was about knowing God as Father and knowing your dad, then this week is really about trusting him. Because what I found is this whole thing of approval really boils down to a question. Will I trust God? Will I trust God to be who he says he is? And will I trust what he says about me? The way that Satan tries to attack Jesus' identity, it's the same way he tries to attack our identity. We have an enemy, and the enemy wants to keep us from home. And in fact, later on in the Bible, Satan is actually referred to specifically as an accuser, as someone who assaults the identity of God's children. This is what it says in Revelation 12. It says, "For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down." This is referring to a time yet to come in the story of God and future history where the voice of the accuser will finally be silenced. But what we get in this verse and what we see in the wilderness is how he operates today. And the way he operates today, the enemy, the accuser, is he continually assaults our identity and wants us to believe that we cannot come home, that we can't be children of God, that we are orphans, that we are not cared for by God. And yet Jesus was able to overcome the accuser, and he comes out of the wilderness, he comes out of that temptation even stronger than when he went in. Luke 4 says this, "Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside." And I believe it was this. I believe one of the aspects of the Spirit's power that was working with Jesus is the power that comes when you are living from approval instead of for approval. I think that was a very clear, distinctive thing because we just see in Jesus this clarity of mission. We see in every situation where he doesn't seem to care necessarily what people think. He's all about pleasing his Father, and he knows his identity in the Father. He has a power because he's living from approval instead of for approval. If you live for approval, you never feel secure. You always feel abandoned. You wonder if this is going to be the time when people walk away. And man, failure is a death sentence. But there is this place of living for approval, a place where you can live in confidence, a place where you can feel like you belong, and a place where you are free to make aggressive mistakes. And the question is, where do we want to live? And how do we get there? And I'm telling you what, you can live a pretty good life as an orphan. You can live a pretty good life if you struggle with approval and you keep performing. Like, stuff can come your way that feels like success, and things can come your way that feel like you're accomplishing, but man, it's just all coming from an unhealthy, unsustainable place. And what I had to realize is, you know what? I'm really a slave to the people I'm trying to seek approval from. And I'm a slave with a specific value equation. Let me show you my orphan, I call it my orphan value equation, is that my worth equals my performance plus other people's opinions. I encourage you to think about what is your value equation, because this was mine. And I guarantee you, whatever it is for you, you've learned how to score points on it. The only thing is it comes with certain side effects. And you don't have to live that way. You don't have to live for approval. You can live from approval. There's hope. And a big part of that is receiving and trusting what Dad says about you. When you actually begin to take ground on this, it's like being rescued in the midst of a storm. But you've got to receive it. You've got to receive it. And I want you to know that journey of receiving for me is really the journey of faith. It's receiving and believing what the Father says about you over and above what the accuser says about you. It's a journey of faith. In our society, there is a group of people who, because of the benevolent act of another person, their identity gets changed permanently and completely, and they literally, in that moment, become part of a new family. They're called adopted children. Think about an adopted child, or if you've adopted a child. Basically, what you did is you saw that child and you said, you are my son. You are my daughter who I love, and with you I am pleased. And then you went and rescued that child from whatever situation they were in, and you brought them into your family. And that's exactly what God has done for you and me through Jesus. It's exactly what he's done for us. It's the gospel of adoption. And in the book of Galatians, a letter written to the early church, it describes it this way. It says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." If you ever want to know what you're worth, if you ever want to know what God thinks about you, look no further than the cross, where Jesus died, because the cross is God's clearest and loudest statement to all of us that you are children that he wants to rescue, that God is in fact a father who is fighting for the custody of his children. He wants to adopt you, and we see on the cross that Jesus paid for your adoption. That word redemption means to pay for something at cost. And when Jesus died, he didn't just pay for the debt of your sin. You may have understood that or heard that before. That is absolutely true. But he also paid for your adoption, because the cost of an adoption is never on the back of the orphan child. It's always and only the parent who pays the expense and says to that child, that son or daughter, "You're my son, whom I love, and with you I am well pleased." And here's the powerful thing. When you are adopted, when you receive that adoption, your status changes in that very moment. This isn't only about something you get when you die, but right now, when you receive the adoption that God has paid for through Jesus, you become a treasured child. And God says to you the same words he said to Jesus, "You are my son, you are my daughter, whom I love, and with you I am well pleased." If you can believe that, man, you can live from approval, not for approval. And God even helps us with that part. He even helps us with the belief part, because Galatians goes on to say, because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. The Spirit who calls out, "Abba, Father." That word Abba is the Aramaic word for daddy. Daddy, daddy. So you are no longer a slave. You're no longer a slave to pleasing people. You're no longer a slave to the approval of that person you want to measure up to. You're no longer a slave to whether or not that person criticizes your work. You are God's child. And since you are his child, he has also made you an heir. Not only do you get a status right now, but you get the family inheritance that is yet to come. And how do we receive that? How do we build faith in that? We don't have to do it on our own. The Spirit of God, the same Spirit that empowered Jesus when he walked out of the wilderness, enables us to live from approval instead of for approval. That same Spirit says to you, says to me, this is what God thinks about you. You're his son. You're his daughter who he loves. And with you I am well pleased. But the question for us is, will we trust our dad?